I'm Amanda. So it's been difficult getting my camera angle today, so I'm going to try to make sure that you're seeing everything and that we don't lose the top of my head. But that may happen, but you can hopefully still hear my voice and see what my hands are doing. So I'm going to start off, as always, we're going to wash hands. This is a recipe that actually might be something fun to do with your kids. There's not much involved with chopping, and it's a lot of just kind of putting things together and stirring it up in a pan. So we are going to make tuna casserole today. Pretty excited about that. I had not made one in a long time, and thought that this would be an excellent dish for us to make. It's a perfect quick meal. Everything's kind of all in one place. I've managed to make this something that leaves room for having other things on the side, like your vegetables or a salad. I think it would be great with broccoli or spinach or carrots. Whatever you like to have. There's a lot of starch going on though, because we do have noodles, and there's even panko crumbs over the top. So choosing a vegetable that also that has peas in it. So we do have a starchy vegetable in it. So it's, while you're going to have one vegetable, it's always good to have 2 or even 3 in a meal. So I would suggest something that's certainly not more peas, not necessarily a potato or corn or one of our starchy vegetables, but kind of going for, those real garden variety ones, like I mentioned, the broccoli, the carrots, the spinach, squash. Squash would be excellent. Something with more color to add to it. And I've had the oven preheating for us already, and I've got my burner already on and warming this skillet, as we're going to just sort of start out with some sauteing in the pan. So what I have is a 2-quart baking dish, and they're always so heavy to me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and lightly spray it with some cooking spray and have it ready. That'll keep things from sticking. And what I've done, as usual, is I have taken another recipe and made modifications to it that are going to add some better health quality to it, more nutrient dense for us. So I've gone, there are a lot of tuna casserole recipes out there. Interestingly enough, I went with the first one that popped up. I thought, there's so many, and what am I going to do to that, except that I know that one of my big focuses has been on vitamin D during this series, fiber, potassium, and trying to keep the added sugars down. So the thing with that is like the new nutrition facts labels are really emphasizing that we have potassium and vitamin D mentioned on labels, because they are something that we kind of don't get enough of. And of course, I've talked about potassium already and its effects with the body. As we know, sodium tends to raise blood pressure, which is fine, except sometimes when we get too much, that blood pressure goes too high. Potassium is what helps lower the blood pressure. So they work together to balance that out. So when potassium levels are off, we find that things like arrhythmias or irregular heartbeats happen, or the blood pressure starts to go up. If we have way too much potassium, the blood pressure can actually go down. With vitamin D, one thing I haven't been talking a lot about, just how important it is. And the big thing is because we know we need to have it. It's the sunshine vitamin, and we know that it's important to bone health because it helps us absorb calcium, but it does so much more. So way deep down in our molecular levels here, what we have is this unique function in the body where we make cells. So vitamin D is involved in telling our cells basically what kind we need to make. What are we in more need of? And even more than that, it actually says, like, well, we've made enough of this. So so it will tell the body, having enough of it, helps the body know when it needs to kind of stop making too many cells. This is where, think about that, like what cells do we not want too much of, right? So think in terms of maybe cancer cells. We don't want too many of those. And vitamin D, if we have enough of it in our body, can tell things like that. Hey, well, that's enough. There is such thing as, there's a lot of other cells that we don't want too many of. So what we have is we have that control. So we don't ever think about it that way. All we usually think about is the bone health, which is also incredibly important. So I'm gonna get started with getting this onion chopped. I already kind of peeled it, and just like I showed us once before, I make these slices toward that closed end that I left on, and I really didn't mean for that end to chop off, but I can still cut it and dice it just fine. And as usual, I'm not looking up at the camera while I try to chop with a sharp knife. I have this glove on again because yes, the cut that I have mentioned in a previous video is still present. It still keeps trying to open back up and not really stay shut. I use my hands a lot. So when I do get a cut on my finger, if it's deep enough, it can be really difficult for me to keep from, just reopening and bleeding again. So in order to protect the food and also in return protect me from the food also, I have a Band-Aid on the cut and I put a glove over my hand, all that double protection to keep everything clean and safe. Okay, so I am going to grab a little bowl. Did not do that ahead of time, so that I can scoop that into this bowl. We're going to need it in our skillet momentarily. And using that flat side of the knife that's not sharp, I'm using it to help scoop up my onions into this bowl. If you have a scraper, those are even better. This kitchen does not have one. So I'm using the back side of this knife to help me scoop it. Okay, so I'm gonna put this over here next to the stove because that's where I'm gonna be next. I have already sliced the mushrooms and I need to rinse them now. So I've got this nice little strainer here. Trying to make sure that any dirt or debris has been washed from the mushrooms. So I did. I bought them pre-sliced. It only cost me about 10 cents more to get that pre-slice. It cuts that time out that sometimes we just don't have, and so it's still pretty inexpensive to buy them. But one thing that is important to know is that just because they're sliced, it doesn't mean that they're clean enough. We still need to rinse our mushrooms when we buy them. Everything else is right over here, and I'm going to head over. There it is. So I'm going to head over here next to the stove. So I found the first tuna casserole recipe that I could find and just sort of closed my eyes and picked, not really, that was just the first one that came up on Google, and it was perfect because this recipe that I found, it has, of course, tuna, which gets us that vitamin D, but also something I noticed is it contained a lot of fat and a lot of sodium, a lot of cholesterol. So when working with canned foods, which we do a couple of items work with canned foods, we're going to find that we get a lot of sodium. But their recipe called for cheese, 2 cups of cheese. I had never had cheese in a tuna casserole before, so I'm like, well, there's my first change right there. So I'm taking 1 tablespoon of olive oil and just going to drizzle it around in this deep skillet. Set that off to the side. So as I'm getting this over here, That gives that a moment to heat. As I said, I've already been heating this. I've already pre-cooked my noodles for this recipe, and they're waiting for me in a bowl. I'll explain why they're just waiting in a bowl in a moment. So I want that. You can already tell that heat is getting a little high. So this being a kitchen, it's not mine. I'm in my church kitchen. I've learned their stovetop gets a lot hotter than mine. So that's perfect. So we're gonna give those onions a minute or two to start to become more transparent. Okay. So if I didn't say before, the oven has been preheated to 375. The original recipe wanted 425 degrees. It felt like that was really hot from what I remember. I did a lot of looking around, and most of the recipes are at 350 to 375, and that I felt more comfortable with because it's possible that their temperature was because there was 2 cups of cheddar cheese in that recipe, and I've completely omitted having cheese in this recipe. So we've had about enough time. It's starting to look a little more see-through, and so I'm going to add our mushrooms in. So this is 1 cup of sliced mushrooms. We also want that to cook for 1 or 2 minutes so they start to soften a little bit. Mushrooms actually also offer us a little bit of dietary fiber. The egg noodle I've chosen is also a whole wheat egg noodle, and that's going to bring extra fiber into this meal that the other recipes don't have. It actually brings 5 grams of fiber to this all by itself, which I'm really happy about. Okay, so I'm going to then take a tablespoon of flour that I pre-measured. I'm going to sprinkle that over the onions and the mushrooms. I love having a sink this handy. So we're going to get those vegetables coated in the flour. So from there, what we want is to add 1 cup of milk, low fat or skim. I have skim here. It just tends to be what I have in my refrigerator. You can choose low fat if you want to. Just keep in mind that that increases the fat in your recipe. Probably not a lot per serving. And also, what we want is to take so we want our salt and our pepper, and we need a half a teaspoon of salt. And 1/4 teaspoon of pepper. Yes, and this time I have the fine ground. From too hot to not quite hot enough once I poured that cold milk in. There we go. So we want the flour that we put on our vegetables are going to help thicken up this milk just a little bit. So interestingly enough, I thought of this because tuna gives us that vitamin D. I can increase the fiber with the noodles being whole wheat. And of course there's plenty of potassium in everything that's going into this dish. And also, bringing up Ellen Satter again, because I read her book years ago, and I mentioned her in one of my videos also when it came to kind of helping to encourage kids to eat was that in that book, she provided a bunch of recipes. This isn't one of hers, and it was actually a little more simple than what I'm doing. But tuna casserole was one of the first things she recommended feeding a family to get them all to eat together and for what we want them to. And again, she made suggestions for things like coleslaw and or salads to have with the meal. So I'm wanting that to thicken up some more. So I honestly didn't know this would be the part where I'd have extra time to talk to you about our recipe here. So what I have been able to do is change a few things between the two recipes. One is those noodles. Two, I used onion just like they did. I used the same amount of tuna they did. Tuna packed in water. That's an important thing. If you have any mercury concerns about tuna, just know that usually the light tuna packed in water is actually young fish, young tuna, and doesn't contain a lot of mercury to worry about. The ones that are higher are like larger adult fish. Albacore is one. So if you're kind of worried about mercury levels for yourself, or if you're pregnant, or about children, canned light tuna is a pretty safe tuna to have. So we are finally thickening up. So of course I'm not doing the cheese. The thing with the cheese was like, wow, that's a lot of cheese, and discovered that per serving, to have that much cheese in that recipe was going to cost 40 cents per serving, and that's a lot, and that's a lot of cheese. That's a lot of fat to add to the meal, saturated fat no less. There we go, finally thickening up a little more. So another thing is, of course, in both recipes, we're both using condensed mushroom soup, which I'm about to add in here momentarily. I had my choice. So I was trying to choose between the low fat and the low sodium, because it's not one and the same. So I chose the low fat, but you can choose the low sodium. Not a bad idea. I don't think it really contributes a whole lot more fat to the dish to choose that one instead. Well, it's 25% less sodium, if I'm saying that, because it does. There's a lot of sodium, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So I've already opened this can of condensed mushroom soup, and I'm going to get that right here. And I have a rubber spatula to help scrape that out. Really trying to get that out of there too. It's thick. So I'm just going to get that here and out of the way. So we're stirring that in. Two 5-ounce cans of light tuna in water. Getting that stirred. And 1 cup of frozen peas. Adding that into the pan. Okay, so what we want to do also is add in a half a teaspoon of garlic powder. heat that through. So, by me using the fresh mushrooms, that's one of the other different things I did with the other recipe. They chose to use canned sliced mushrooms, which really contains no vitamin D. I actually was able to bring a little extra vitamin D into the recipe by choosing the fresh mushrooms and sauteing them a little bit in the pan. So mushrooms that are grown in UV light are going to be the ones that are going to contain some vitamin D. So that is usually the fresh mushrooms. So we are just about ready to mix this in with our egg noodles. So I put some foil over it so it didn't get too cold on me. And I put it into a big bowl because if I were to try to put these noodles into this pan, it was going to get really full and possibly overflow. It'd be difficult for me to stir it all together. So I'm going to turn this off right now. Okay, so I need to move, still need my spatula to stir with, making sure that these haven't tried to stick together a little bit while they sat there for a few minutes. And I'm going to pour our liquid part of our tuna casserole in and scrape as much out into this bowl. It smells pretty good. Keep looking around me thinking, oh my, did I forget any of these ingredients? Always worried I'm going to do that. So taking that wooden spoon, I'm going to go ahead and gently fold that all in together, going slow, trying to make sure I don't spill any out over the side or onto myself. Okay, last difference between my recipe and the other recipe, or so I can remember, is that they called for 1 cup crushed potato chips. And you may have done that yourself at home, but I did some figuring with the potato chips, and they contribute 165 calories to your one serving all by themselves. And that was a big thing to me. Of course, it's really high in sodium. Potato chips are, basically, it's a deep fried food. And on top of that, it's about 19 cents per serving to have potato chips. That's me very fairly using the proprietary brand at the store, going with the cheapest potato chip possible. So I chose panko crumbs today, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second, because I'm pouring this into our already greased with vegetable oil spray baking dish. Yes, I'm that person who tries to get as much out of there as possible. So I'm going to move the bowl out of my way. Nice full sink. So I'm going to help spread that down. Flatten it out a little bit. And so I'm using Italian panko crumbs. Alright, so this is the little iffy part here. So I saved on calories, saved on fat, all of that. Not necessarily, I don't know that I saved a whole lot more on the sodium. It does contain some sodium. I don't think it contains as much as the potato chips. But for whatever reason, it had a tiny bit of added sugar in it. And per serving, it comes out to 1 gram of added sugar to each serving of food. And that's actually where the other side beats me a little bit. But I've got a little more to tell you here in a second about that. And I'm going to try to get this sprinkled over evenly. So 1 cup of Italian seasoned panko crumbs. And that's why. That's where the sodium, that's where that little tiny bit of sugar is coming from, is because I chose the flavored. If you use plain panko, you're probably going to need to flavor it yourself anyway, and I don't know how much different things would turn out other than maybe the sugar part. So really trying to get this even. Okay, so we are all sprinkled and we are all ready to go into the oven. It's really low to the ground. Now we want that in there on that center rack. For a second I thought I touched the inside of the door. I did not. And that's gonna cook in there for 30 minutes. So let's turn that timer on to 30. Start. Hey, I did it. So a few little extras about our meal here, and we're getting pretty close to done, is that their meal actually costs $1.56 per serving. Somehow, some way, I managed to make mine less expensive. It costs $1.15 per serving. So some of our big differences come in, okay, I am on the right side of the page, is that we are at 340 calories versus their 595 calories. I managed to get our fat down to 7 grams with basically no saturated fat compared to their 32.1 grams of fat. And I had a sheet here that told me their saturated fat. Now it's not here, but theirs did have quite a bit of saturated fat. So the fiber in there said 0 fiber in theirs. I have been able to get us 8 grams of fiber. There is that 1 gram of added sugar they don't have. The sodium in mine is 987 milligrams of sodium. Still quite a bit. It mainly comes from the tuna in that condensed soup. But theirs was still higher at 1,061. So our potassium, they beat me on potassium. They have 620 milligrams of potassium versus my 520, but that mainly came from the cheese that I took out. If I put all that cheese in, I would have had a really high fat food with more sodium, more saturated fat. So the trade-off isn't as bad for me. Their vitamin D was at 34 international units for the tuna in it. And that's where I got a lot of mine from. But with the milk, with the mushrooms, I came in at 57 international units of vitamin D. So pretty good. So nice meal to have for your family. And so the recipe, all the nutrition information, and even some fun little facts with that nutrient density and the cost. The cost per nutrition, comparison is all in my description. I really hope you enjoy this. By the way, it's like magic. It's already done. So I had one ready for you to look at. I think it looks good, I think it smells good, and I sure hope you enjoy it. So you guys have a good night, have a great dinner, and I've got one more video coming for you this week, so I hope you're ready to see that too. I'll see you then. Bye.